Today our story takes place in the shadow of Windsor Castle, that has stood hard by an adjoining forest for nearly 1,000 years. But our story is far older than the stone and mortar of that great Norman stronghold. Exactly how much older is hard to say. I believe that one of the old gods may be hiding amongst one of Britain's most popular folk tales. This is the story of Hearn the Hunter. Our story takes place during the reign of Richard II, in what's now a public green space known as Windsor Great Park, a leafy oasis amongst London's sprawling suburbia. But in the 14th century, it was a rural and quite rugged place. The forest was the private hunting grounds of the king. He employed a large retinue of gamekeepers and huntsmen to manage the forests and to help maintain its wild game. Hearn was one such huntsman. He was a talented woodsman, the fastest rider, and the best tracker. When he rode out with the king, they always had a successful hunt. He soon became Richard's favourite. This made the other keepers jealous. One day, during a thrilling chase, Hearn and the king rode side by side. They galloped through the forest in pursuit of a giant stag. The powerful creature charged through the thicket, its movements so fast and sharp that Hearn and the king soon lost sight of it. Hearn dismounted from his horse, examined the tracks in the mud, the broken branches and the disturbed undergrowth, searching for signs that to you or I would be imperceptible. Within moments, Hearn found the stag's trail. With one swift leap, he mounted his horse. He sharply spurred it on. The king now taking his lead. The pair had become separated from the rest of the party, who couldn't keep up. This had happened several times before, and the king relished these moments. All the decorum and the posturing of the court faded away. Out here in the forest, all that mattered was the quarry. They closed in on their prey. Eventually, they cornered it by a fallen tree. The king drew his bow, but before he could loose an arrow, the stag charged at him with a desperate leap. Hearn threw himself between the beast and his royal master, taking the full force of its antlers into his midriff. The pair became entwined. On the forest floor they fought for their lives. The stag, with impossible strength, kept goring at Hearn, while the cunning huntsman reached for his knife and managed to thrust it into the animal's neck. Even under such brutal attack, he was deadly with his blade. The stag collapsed. Hearn lay clinging to life amongst the briar and the brambles. The king watched this all unfold. It had all happened in an instant, and he hadn't had the time to intervene. He looked down at Hearn, who was motionless now, clinging onto life by a thread. He began shouting for help. The rest of the hunting party can't be far away, he thought, but it wasn't courtiers or huntsmen who heeded his cries. Out of the trees stepped an old man, wrapped in a leaf cloak, with a grey, weathered face and bright, shining eyes. I can save this man's life. If you want him to survive, you must not question how I do it. The king was taken back by the claim, but agreed. He had heard of old men who lived wildly in the forest and had powers of healing. It was his only chance at saving faithful Hearn. The old man began by lighting a fire of oak wood. Then he began chanting strange incantations while setting about removing the antlers from the expired stag. He took the antlers and tethered them to Hearn's head, so that it appeared as if Hearn had grown them himself. Half man, half stag, the old man's conjuring reached a crescendo and abruptly stopped. By this time, the hunting party had caught up and watched on in amazement. Hearn's eyes flickered. Then, slowly, they opened. Miraculously, he managed to stand and mount his horse, his wounds already seeming less severe. The old man didn't ask for any payment, only to be allowed to carry on living in the forest. The hunting party made their way slowly back to Windsor. Every step his horse took cut Hearn like a knife, but he knew he would survive. If you're enjoying this video, please like, subscribe and leave a comment. This is a special video edition of my new podcast. If you want more stories like this, please sign up to my Patreon, where I'll regularly upload stories like this in podcast form, which members can listen to on Spotify. I'll leave the link in the description, and thanks to everyone for supporting the channel. Now, let's get back to Hearn. Weeks passed, and despite all odds, Hearn made a full recovery. The king rewarded him for his bravery by making him the head keeper of Windsor. This made the other keepers furious. Their resentment for him grew even deeper. One day when Hearn was preoccupied in a far corner of the forest, the huntsman and keepers met beneath an oak tree. Fueled on by envy, they decided to pay the old healer a visit. They found him in his willow hut amongst the brush. They lied to the old man and told him that Hearn had been bragging about how he had healed himself through his own will. The old man threw into a rage and began once again with his dreadful incantations. He conjured a curse that would cause Hearn to lose all of his woodland crafts and hunting skills. Soon enough, the wild game in the forest began to dwindle. The king's hunts became less and less fruitful. Hearn could no longer keep up with the hunting party. His horse felt as if it was running through thick honey, like in a terrible nightmare. He could no longer track the simplest of game, let alone the mighty stags that the king had a taste for. After several months, the king had had enough. He released Hearn from his service. Hearn was mortified. He had known no other life but that of hunting and gamekeeping. He had no other trade. He was ashamed, and he was destitute. Several days later, one of the keepers was riding through the woods, and on a huge oak tree, he saw Hearn hanging by the neck, limp and lifeless. He rode back to the keeper's lodgings to alert the others. Filled with shame, they all went to retrieve Hearn's body. As they set off, a huge storm broke. Great forks of lightning licked the forest canopy. Thick bulbs of rain drenched the guilty huntsmen as they hurried to find Hearn's body. But when they reached the giant oak, his body was gone. Bewildered, they returned home. The king heard about Hearn's passing that night and felt a pang of grief and regret that he had played a part in such a tragedy. The next day, the king was out riding when a ghostly retinue of huntsmen appeared before him, accompanied by vile black hounds with red eyes. At the head of the unworldly pack was a grim figure in the shape of a man with antlers on his head. The king recognized him to be Hearn. His wounds from his encounter with the deer had returned, as if they were freshly made, but his blood was dark, and his skin an unnatural grey. His eyes burned like hellfire. With a dark voice, he told the king about the curse the old man had put upon him at the request of the other huntsmen. Then, with a roar of thunder, Hearn and his party galloped up into the sky. The king rounded up every guilty huntsman and had them hanged from the same tree as Hearn. He sent men to look for the old sorcerer, but he was nowhere to be found. To this day, Hearn is still seen riding through the forest, thriving off the fear and horror that he installs in anyone caught wandering the woods on a dark winter's night, looking to claim another rider for his ghostly pack. That was the story of Hearn the Hunter. I can't wait to unpack this. It's one of the most influential folk tales from Britain. Hearn is first mentioned in Shakespeare's play The Merry Wives of Windsor. Here's a little extract of it. There is an old tale goes that Hearn the Hunter, sometime a keeper here in Windsor Forest, doth all the winter time and still midnight walk around an oak with great ragged horns and shakes a chain. So The Merry Wives of Windsor was written in around 1597, and Shakespeare here is telling us that by this point, Hearn was already an old story. Now, anyone who's familiar with folklore will recognise what's known as the wild hunt. It's a motif that's found throughout folklore in Europe. It's present in the Celtic and the Germanic traditions. Essentially, it's an otherworldly hunt that roam the earth, claiming the souls of the deceased and occasionally clashing with mortals. Sometimes it's just a solitary huntsman, other times a lone hound. Sometimes it's an entire host. In the Germanic tradition, it's led by Woden or Odin. In the Celtic tradition, often it's King Arthur or Arwen who leads the hunt. The leader of the hunt changes depending on what the culture projects onto it. For example, in Dartmoor during the 17th century, Richard Campbell, who was a despised local lord, was said to lead the wild hunt with a pack of black hounds. This story is what inspired Arthur Conan Doyle to write The Hound of the Baskervilles. Seeing a black hound was portentous of doom. Those who saw it could have bad luck befall them or fall into despair. The black dog has become a euphemism for depression. Here is an example of Woden, or Wode as he's known in the German, leading the wild hunt, collected by the renowned folklore collector Joseph Grimm, who dedicated his life to collecting stories from German peasants. Here is a quick story, just to show you the parallels that it has to Hearn. Often of a dark night the airy hounds will bark. The countryman knows their leader, Wode. A peasant coming home tipsy one night hears the wild hunt. Suddenly, out of the clouds, there plunges down a tall man on a white horse. "Are you strong?" he says. "Here, catch hold of this chain, and we'll see which can pull the hardest." The peasant courageously grasps the heavy chain, and up flew the wild hunter into the air. The peasant twisted the end around an oak tree that was near, and the hunter tugged in vain. "Have you tied your end to the oak?" asked Wode. "No," replied the peasant. "Look, I'm holding it in my hands." "Then you'll be mine up in the clouds," cried the hunter as he swung himself aloft. The peasant hurriedly knotted the chain around the oak tree again, and Wode could not manage it. "Well pulled," said the hunter. "Many's a man I've made mine. You are the first that ever held out against me. You shall have your reward." A stag then falls from the heights before him, and Wode cuts it up. He tells the peasant to walk home with blood and flesh for wife and child. So what's going on there is essentially a tug of war between Wode and this peasant. The parallels there are interesting, particularly the mentioning of the shaking of the chain, which Shakespeare mentioned. It seems to me as if Hearn is a folk memory of the god Woden. Here is a little example of what folk memory actually is. So let's say you're an Anglo Saxon pagan. Everyone believes that Woden leads a hunt of riders and hounds that charge across the sky, claiming the souls of the dead or the unlucky living who stray too far from home. This is what they genuinely would have believed, just like medieval Christians would have believed that Christ rose from the dead. You're caught in a violent storm. Lightning splits the horizon. You see something through the rain. You're genuinely afraid for your life. It's a terrifying spiritual experience. You interpret it through the only framework you have. It's the wild hunt. You tell your children. They grow up fearing these riders. One day they may see something in a storm, and they remember your story. They then pass that story on to their children. Generations pass. Christianity arrives. You're told not to believe in Woden. But the storms still come. The strange shapes still move through the clouds and the darkness. Someone sees something they can't explain, and it reminds them of the old story. The name Woden fades, but the experience remains. The details are blurred over time, but the essence of the story survives, even when the god does not. Or maybe the wild hunt is real. It isn't my place to say. To me, Hearn is clearly a remnant of our pagan past, a deity that's been smuggled into popular belief, surviving for thousands of years through the stories that we pass down to one another. Thank you so much for listening. If you are not a member of my Patreon, please consider subscribing. This is a kind of taster episode. There'll be exclusive episodes like this on my paid membership Patreon. So if you enjoyed this, there's more where that came from.